Wang Yi pays an official visit to Ethiopia, Burkina Faso, Gambia, and Senegal in the new year. What tops his agenda there? How do those countries view partnership with China, and how does the rest of the international society look at closer ties between China and Africa? To discuss these issues and more, I'm very happy to be joined in the Beijing studio by He Wenping from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences and Walter Ruigu, Managing Director of CAMAL Group. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Wenping, what do you think of the agenda of State Councillor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi's current visit?
First of all, this is a kind of routine Chinese foreign minister will do in the, at the beginning of the year. This kind of routine has been there for, I think, more than 20 years. So this shows, of course, very obvious.
What kind of a routine visit? I mean, without exceptions, at the beginning of a new year, the foreign minister would always choose Africa as the first overseas trip. Is that what you mean?
Oh, yes, exactly. Because this is to show China has paid a great attention to develop the relation with Africa. So Africa always the first travel destination for a Chinese foreign minister. So I think if my memory is correct, I think it started from 1990. So all the way. So every year, no exception for that. So this year, I think like Foreign Minister Wang Yi chose those 4 countries. So it's very meaningful, like Ethiopia now has been widely regarded as China in Africa. So they have been developed the industrialization in a very rapid way together with China's engagement there. A lot of Chinese investment has been investing in Ethiopia's industrial, capacity building. So the second one, like Burkina Faso, Gambia, they are all the newly countries, resumed the diplomatic ties with China. So I think this is a very right time to visit those 2 countries to cement this China and those 2 countries' relations. And also like Senegal is going to be host the next China-Africa Cooperation Forum. I think it's in the 12, this is 12, 19, and then plus 3 years, 2022. So they will host another FOCAC meeting. Also, it's very important, Western African countries, they're French-speaking. Used to be, there's less China's engagement in those French-speaking African countries. There are more in the East Coast countries. African countries are less there. So I think this kind of visit, plus President Xi Jinping himself also visited Senegal in 2018, just passed this July. So this is another, I think, further strengthen our bilateral ties.
You seem to have answered all of my questions about this current trip by Foreign Minister Wang Yi. But obviously, the agenda of our State Councillor and Foreign Minister, Mr. Wang Yi's agenda has been carefully crafted to live up to the expectations of our brothers and sisters in Africa. But Walter, what do you make of the implications of this agenda, despite all the convincing and insightful analysis by Madam He Wenping?
Yeah, I think like Madam He just explained, this is part of China's tradition of visiting the continent, and the 4 countries were carefully chosen. So I think when you look at China-Africa relationship from a high level, I think that has already been established, that is good, there's room to develop, but now what matters more is on the ground, what is happening on the ground. And you, of course, the overhanging question now between China and Africa is the debt issue. So that was not covered as much, but it's definitely going to be one of the discussions that will come up during the trip.
But is there a solution to the alleged debt issue that was deliberately aroused by Western media to capture attention from those who are skeptical about China's ambitions and vision in this promising continent?
I have been doing research about China-Africa for a long time. Sometimes it's very ironically to observe. Those issues, some people saying as the biggest concern, actually it's coming from media first. It's not coming from
You seem to be critical of the media, the role that I play.
No. Some media.
Some media.
Of course, Chinese media.
Which is motivated by politics.
Yes, politics like this debt issue, like my colleagues just mentioned, it's not started from Africa themselves. It started from Western countries, some media there. Actually, I think 3 years ago when I paid a visit to France, and I had chances to talk about, this Africa issue, China-Africa cooperation with France, those journalists and also some officials and some business person. Even as early as that time, they are saying, oh, very good, we appreciate China's engagement with Africa, you pay great attention there, you put a lot of investment, but be careful, those money, it caused the debt issue. So this is not good because Paris, club now has been doing this debt relief project there. But none of them coming from, those concerns coming from Africa side. Recently, I have also seen the Kenya President Kenyatta also answered this issue in a press conference. So in his words, like those kind of education saying China is going to take away Mombasa, this port, because they cannot pay back the money for building this Mombasa-Nairobi railway. So President Kenyatta said this is a totally groundless allegation because first of all, there's no such kind of item has been written in that kind of loan providing agreement. So this is not that kind of item. Secondly, President Kenyatta said they even will pay ahead of those yearly paid those debt to China. So there's no question about short of payment. Mombasa Railway now has done a very good business. I visited that railway twice. Yeah, when it is in construction.
It is true somehow that the media always plays a nasty role in shaping negative perceptions about whatever they want to alert attention to. Water, President Xi Jinping promised to contribute up to $60 billion in aid, investment, and financing to Africa, and much of this, most of the beneficiaries of such a massive investment project will be in the sub-Saharan region. Do you think China's approach is indeed an issue of a conspiracy?
I think that question we need to step back and analyze it, because is there a big conspiracy coming from China towards Africa? Of course not. But that is not the issue that any legitimate observer is looking at. The people who are legitimately questioning the relationship, they have some legitimate issues to be raised. But the problem that is happening is that there's just too much noise that is going on between China and Africa. What do I mean by this? When I read Chinese media, I think, wow, China-Africa relations are the best thing that ever happened to the continent. Mm-hmm. When I read Western media, especially New York Times, Financial Times, I think, my God, China-Africa relationship is doomed. And like any other thing in this society, the truth is somewhere in between. The issue of Kenya's debt, for instance, depending on what story somebody wants to tell, they will find the facts to back it up. So for instance, there have been people who have been claiming that Kenya's debt to China is 70%. So what does that mean? That is actually the bilateral debt. That is not the external debt for Kenya. The external debt of Kenya towards China is only 20%. So the people who want to portray China in a negative image will work with the higher number. The people who want to tell a better story will work with the lower number. But in reality, the truth is somewhere in between. There are issues that are arising from this relationship, and the issues need to be addressed. But the problem is right now it's very difficult to find middle ground, because one side thinks everything is perfect and the other side thinks everything is negative. So there really needs to be a shift in how these issues are engaged.
What I've been doing on Dialogue since almost 20 years ago is to try to present a complete picture by balancing views from Africa against somehow the very positive, very promising views from the Chinese experts in this case. Now, it seems we have a lot more work to do to minimize the negative impact of prejudice and pride. Having said this, the Trump administration, has unveiled a new Africa policy while accusing China and Russia of exploiting Africa with predatory policies that stunt the growth of African nations, allegedly, and threaten their independence. Wow, this is just a nasty depiction of China's presence in Africa. I went to South Africa to cover the China-African Summit, and I was impressed by China's enormous input into our campaign to help industrialize the impoverished sub-Saharan region. Of course we would export overcapacity. Of course we would help, first of all, build infrastructure So what do you think of, you know, such efforts which may threaten to undermine the independence of African nations?
I will say this, and I've said it many times before, and I'll keep saying it because I believe it's the truth. The best thing that China ever did in Africa was create competition. In 2000, the economist said that Africa was the lost continent. China did not think so. That's when FOCAC was established. So over the years, China has, you know, implemented infrastructure projects, investments, etc. But, you know, China doesn't exist by themselves in the world. There was competition. The United States was getting ready to cut the budget of the foreign aid before this program was established. Now a $60 billion program supposed to counter China in Africa. From the African point of view, one, the fact that America has come back to the table, the fact that the road from Mombasa to Nairobi will be built by an American company, for us is good news. And this would have not happened without China, because China being there has created competition. But to answer your question, do I think what John Bolton and his team has said, you know, our main purpose in Africa is to counter China? I don't see where any benefit can come through that. If your mission is not to work with the Africans to understand what the problem is, if your only mission is to counter China in Africa, then of course it's doomed to be failed. And you know, in the 60s and 70s, when America was beginning its large foreign aid programs towards Africa, a lot of it, even the World Bank, was focused on infrastructure. But somewhere around the 80s, that changed. It changed more to soft aid. But now it seems we're back to the original stage, and this is mainly because of what China has been doing on the continent. So, you know, I don't want to speculate a lot. I think overall it's a good thing that the Americans are back. We just have to wait and see whether the program will work.
In a typical market economy, competitions would definitely generate more benefits for consumers as a result. So despite the two major players, if not well, they are also strategic competitors in Africa. We have Japan, the European Union. What do you think of the response from, for example, Mr. Claude Juncker, chairman of the European Union? And he also voiced somehow the concerns on that trap. What do you think of the dilemma of the European Union in making a choice between the United States and China since the Trump administration launched the trade war?
In terms of cooperation with Africa, I think our policy and our attitude has been always very clear. That is, welcome all the countries, engage with Africa, because Africa now developed, comparatively speaking, still lag behind. So they need help. Even though they have a huge potential to be discovered. So this kind of cooperation, if leads to some kind of competition, I don't think it's a bad thing, like we just discussed. Competition can bring more this kind of choice or alternative for Africans. So Africa now is sitting in the driving seat. So more partners, more beneficial for them, so which is nice. So, but if you bring some kind of a zero-sum game in this kind of competition, which is not good, for those players, also not good for Africans themselves, because they hardly find any room to, to cooperate with all those players.
Given the bitter memories of the Cold War, people could easily jump to the conclusion that the nasty competitions in Africa may well culminate with proxy wars, and that was very bloody during the Cold War. You are watching Dialogue with Dr. He Wenping from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences and Mr. Walter Ruigu, Managing Director of a CAMAL group. We'll be back in a short while. Stay with us, please. Welcome back. Well, how much does it take to have a big success on the industrialization in Africa?
Well, this is a long process. I think, for example, when we review our China's past 40 years reform and opening up, so first we have to have a very, this rich human resources, very skillful, those workers, especially technicians. They can do all those construction work, not only PhD. So, and also second is infrastructure. So this infrastructure served as a basis for this takeoff of industrialization. And the third one, I think, is the market itself. Now, comparing with China, I think African market is not big, not united.
What about the financing vehicles, the performance of the Chinese banks in Africa?
Yeah, financial things is not something I'm going to address because even though you have human resources, you have a market, you have those resources anyway, but if you don't have money, nothing you can be push forward. So this is another shortcoming Africa have because those this serving deposit rate is very low in Africa, and then the investment coming from other continent now is getting down rather than getting up. And also development assistance, you can see from Trump administration they cut those development assistance rather than to pushing forward. So because of this shortage of the financial means, and then China now willing to make these things happening in Africa. So we offered a lot of like China Africa Development Fund, and then we have AIIB, now even the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank now is willing to do the investment in Africa.
Wait a minute, last year saw the normalization of the bilateral relationship between Japan and China. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe promised to cooperate with China in building infrastructure in a third country. What did he mean? Does it actually refer to Africa water, for example?
Yes, I think it's not only Japan. I think we've also seen this with the United Kingdom. They also have a similar program to work with China. But basically what is happening, if you observe China-Africa relationship, is that this has not been done before, at least not on this scale. In terms of financing, if we expect only China to finance the infrastructure gap in Africa, then of course that is doomed for failure. So the question has become, how can even the Americans work together with China? And from the African perspective, the best thing to do is just to try from single projects, because you will learn what works from that project, what doesn't work, and move on to the rest. Everything else is just theory and just discussion. That's how I view the best approach to this.
On January the 1st, 1979, the bilateral relationship between the United States of America and China were established during the Carter administration. Now, this senior politician, whom I respect so much, said recently about the bilateral relationship between Washington and China, confrontation will have no future. And he said Africa might be a good place for reducing the trust deficit and to promote mutual understanding. Africa needs competition, as you said, wisely. What do you think of the possibility that the two sides, Washington and Beijing, will join hands instead of taking each other as the enemy? Because Africans won't necessarily buy this idea that what China does here also shares the vision of President Trump about the zero-sum game.
This will 100% depend on the Africans. It's as simple as that. If the host nation is willing to accept both parties and is willing to work with both of them and is willing to set the ground rules, then of course it will work. And we have seen this in Kenya, for instance. There's been high-level state visits from the UK, from France, from Korea, from Turkey. So the question is, what are the Africans going to do about it? Because now Africa has become the girl that everybody else wants. So it's as simple as that. I don't think that the big powers should dictate how it's going to necessarily work in the local countries. So I think this waits to be seen. Again, Africa is made up of 54 countries. Each has a different system. Each has a different leader. So it's actually a very good place to test the different kind of cooperation models.
Wimping, Zimbabwe, for example, has been a very close friend of China, but its image remains very controversial due to the lackluster economic performance and, of course, a confiscation of the farming land by former president of this country, Dr. Mugabe. Having said this, what do you think of the image of China to be friend with all countries, including, of course, democracies that started to take root in democratic institutions with the end of the Cold War? China, President Xi Jinping said, wouldn't vie for sphere of influence. We wouldn't fight any proxy wars. But, for example, the issue of corruption always captures headlines these days whenever you look at the Western media regarding the influence of China. What do you think of this kind of a soft pedaling approach by China, quote unquote?
Yeah, first of all, we need to have our own speaking power. Even though we have been doing quite good job, but those image like hanging around with those corruptive official, or like China's engagement, even driving those corruption behavior becoming, bigger, or rather than getting the less. But actually, picture is different. I will highly recommend, the American scholar Broticum, her book is called Dragon's Gift in Africa, the real story of China in Africa. So in one chapter, he mentioned that China's, assistance to Africa, all those projects, is called a project-driven approach. So which means we will not like pass through all those money in those recipient countries, their budget.
Does China ever seek to have a regime change to lay the groundwork for building infrastructure?
Not. China's policy is non-interference with other countries' domestic issue. So I'm just mentioning about this money issue. Even those monies go all the way to the projects, will not go via the financial minister, their budget. So actually it's difficult for the local officials doing those corruptive issue, because it's not go through their budget. So it's go all the way to those projects itself. So eventually
let's
you will
look at
see.
the mega project of help build the headquarters in Addis Ababa of the African Union. Now, a lot of the Western media would say, hey, let's look at China's ambition and the implications in helping build the headquarters in Addis Ababa. It smacks of a strategic conspiracy or whatever. I mean, it doesn't sound very nice.
I think the first question is to ask is who wanted the headquarters? Was it China that wanted headquarters, or was it the African Union that wanted the headquarters? This was a gift from China to Africa. In fact, the company that built that headquarters, China State Construction, lost money doing that project. So it's a gift, okay? So you can choose how you want to analyze it. There have been other gifts to other African countries. So I would not read too much into that kind of project.
Ethiopia, similarly with other African economies, Wenping is exploring the best possible ways of employing its natural resources and its demographic dividends so as to transform its agriculture-dominated economy towards becoming the manufacturing hub of Africa. Question is, how can China share its development model with them? Or do you think China's model cannot be easily copied by our brothers and sisters in Africa?
Yeah, actually a lot of experience now has been taken from China's those model or experience. One of those things is this industrial zone. I visited this industrial zone. It's called Oriental Industrial Zone in Ethiopia. So it has been approved very successful because a lot of Chinese investors set up in that zone, and they either produce like shoes or like making cement or whatever. So it's becoming a driving force to lead the way of Ethiopia industrialization. So not only those Chinese build those zones from government or from the private company. Now Ethiopia government has built on a lot of industry zones by themselves. Yeah, even some industry zones is leading this environment friendly. Yeah, this kind of new thinking. So it has been proved very successful. So even from this one point, I can see this is a good way of learning this China's experience, because China's way has been proved. This industry zone, like around our coastal cities, like in Xiamen, like in this, Zhejiang, Jiangsu, so Shanghai. So they have been leading the way, and then gradually spill over those experience to those landlocked, like China, other provinces. So Ethiopia also. It has leads the way, and then not only spill over those development results to other parts like agricultural industry and other like manufacture, and also even goes to other countries like Djibouti. I traveled to Djibouti this last August. So Djibouti people even told me, saying they travel to Addis Ababa very often, but whenever they go there, they see the different, they see the changes, they see the development. So they also think they cannot be lag behind. They have to hurry up.
We have also initially established our military presence in Djibouti to guarantee our efforts to fight piracy and to escort ships, Chinese and foreign alike. Now, last year saw the 40th anniversary of China's opening up and reform. Our friends, politicians, policymakers in Africa must have followed the process of China's development very closely. Do you think you have anything to learn from China or the other way around to avoid making the same mistakes that we made over the past 40 years?
Again, I think for this, one of the references I would use was the speech by His Excellency Paul Kagame at the FOCAC last year. He said at the beginning of his speech, very brief speech, first, yes, China, we understand China treats us as equal on the high level. I think everybody has already accepted that. But now when it comes to development, it is a responsibility of every African nation to set its policy and set its development path vis-a-vis China. So for instance, the example you used of Ethiopia is a very good example of a country that can successfully replicate the Chinese model. And there are many reasons for that. The Ethiopian system is similar, the system of governance, you know, the industrial policy, and it's working successfully. But in other countries, they have a different system, they have a different history, so everybody needs to set their own development path. And I think this has been very clear from the Chinese side. I think what gets emphasized, does not get emphasized as much is, you know, yes, there are things we should learn from China on how to do, but there are also things that we can learn from China how not to do. And, you know, especially the issue of environment, during China's growth, this was seen as something that can be put on the back burner while development takes place. Fortunately or unfortunately, the reality is for different countries, you cannot be able to sustainably take the same path. But at the same time, there are new technologies that are available today that are not available when China just began to open up. So the short answer to your question is it really depends on which African country, and the African countries that have specifically set policy for engagement with China, for instance, Ethiopia and South Africa, these are the ones that are set to really benefit the most from the relationships. For the others, you know, they really need to, you know.
Thank you so much. You don't know how much I appreciate your participation and analysis, which I believe has somehow provided a convincing textbook about the presence of China there, and of course competition. And we hope the competition should be benevolent between major players, be they United States, European, Chinese, Japanese, or Indians. With that, we come to the end of this edition about the implications of Foreign Minister Wang Yi's visit of Africa, the first of its kind since the start of 2019, which witnessed the 40th anniversary of the bilateral relationship between Washington and China. Until next time, goodbye.
This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.